Hey everyone, this is Professor Beebe. I'm going to go through the highlights from Chapter 2. Chapter 2 covers kind of the key players in the history of epidemiology, if you will. So I think your chapter does a really nice job of talking about the stories of these individuals. So I'm going to use this time to focus on a couple some more information than you see in your chapter on some of these individuals. Uh, but I do want you to cover everyone, but I'm just going to focus on some that have more colorful histories, if you will. All right. Here's our objectives that you can read on your own. But basically, this chapter is looking at kind of how we got to this whole idea of modern epidemiology. So, individuals in epidemiology were the curious individuals. Okay. These are ones that wanted to know why. They wanted to understand things. They wanted to be able to explain what they were seeing as far as health status or injury or illness. Okay. And they wanted to make a difference. They wanted to make situations better. So these are kind of the type of person that's going to make this list. So Hippocrates is considered the first epidemiologist. He became known as the father of medicine, and once again, like I said, the first epidemiologist. He took special care in not only looking at individuals, looking at individuals for their health status, looking at individuals to see what was wrong with them, but he also started to branch that focus out to include the place. And we find out that that's very important as far as some of the success of certain disorders or diseases. Okay, where they're happening, what's the environment like, and also the time aspects of disease. So he was very important in branching out the study of health, not just looking at the individual that came through the door for help, but looking at a larger picture of health. Okay. He observed that different diseases occurred in different locations and the importance of those locations. So, the whole idea that when he saw malaria and yellow fever, they tended to occur in areas that were swampy. Okay. So, at that time, he did not know that we were talking about a disorder that was being transmitted by a mosquito, being transmitted by this vector. But he did recognize that certain environments, such as a swampy area, we were going to see more cases of malaria and yellow fever than we were in areas of deserts or in tundras or arid areas. He also introduced the terms of epidemic and endemic. Thomas Sydenham is someone that, once again, you can read about in your book. But he also looked at the idea of treatments and remedies that were outside of the original idea of medication. So, looking at the idea of exercise and fresh air being important to the health of the individuals. Okay, healthy diet. Now, nowadays, that's a very forward thinking approach to disease or disorder. But in these times, and we're talking about in the 1600s, we're looking at someone who was kind of ridiculed for those types of thoughts. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind is that when these new ideas come along, and ideas and concepts that now we take for granted or now we accept as truth, the at the time, these were very new and foreign ideas. And many of these individuals that we're going to be talking about in this chapter were ridiculed for their thoughts. Okay, some to extreme measures. And they were right. Some of them died not knowing they were right or not knowing everything that they actually brought to epidemiology and modern medicine. Okay. James Lind was important for the idea of having citrus fruits, and employed experimental methods to identify the idea that having citrus fruits on ships was a remedy for scurvy among sailors. Okay, so we're looking at kind of the application then of these ideas. Um, Benjamin Jesty was a farmer and dairyman who noticed that his milkmaids never got smallpox, but did get cowpox. And he was, and this is another thing that you might recognize or you're going to see, is that many of these individuals that we're talking about not only were very forward thinking, but they took a lot of risk. And they did things that nowadays would be frowned upon and would not be allowed. As far as, Benjamin Jesty actually exposed his wife and children to cowpox um, as a way of testing his theory. Okay. Edward Jenner, excuse me, is another individual that we think of frequently when we think of smallpox. He actually invented a vaccination for smallpox. Um, and he also was looking at the idea of these dairymaids, and if they were exposed to this mild case of cowpox, all right, they would not get ill. Okay, so this was the beginning of this idea of creating a vaccine by exposure. Semmelweis was a very interesting man. He is one that when I was talking about people becoming highly ridiculed, Semmelweis is the first one that comes to mind as far as what he suffered because of his beliefs. He observed that in a in obstetrics, okay, he observed that individuals or mothers, excuse me, obstetric patients that were in the medical school, okay, where the student doctors would go routinely travel from their working labs or their cadaver labs where they were learning to actually practice in delivery. And he was noticing that those females that were in those medical schools, had a higher likelihood of dying from childbirth, okay, or getting the childbed fever than those that were not part of that program. Okay, so he surmised or he proposed that the problem was that these students were not washing their hands before the moving from the cadaver lab to the to help deliver the babies. Okay. Well, he was absolutely ridiculed for that. He was actually chased out of his position within the medical school for the belief that these individuals should be washing their hands before moving from the cadaver lab to to the birthing room. Okay. Nowadays, washing your hands isn't even a second thought. I mean, we look for individuals or the healthcare professionals to wash their hands when they walk into the examining room. They use hand sanitizers. So it's something now that we can't even imagine. But in the 1800s, when Semmelweis was in practice, he was highly ridiculed to the point where, like I said, he was actually chased out of his position, moved to another town, and actually went insane from kind of the ridicule and the professional downgrade that he got. Very tragic. John Snow was, I'm sure many of you have heard of John Snow. We always think of the pump handle. With John Snow, he gave us probably some of the best descriptive and analytical epidemiology studies that we were talking about, with the whole idea of cholera in London. Um, he followed the individuals. He interviewed the individuals that were affected, trying to figure out what their water source was. So he was working back. He was doing this first full descriptive example of epidemiology. So what he did was he interviewed all these individuals and then he mapped that distribution. Remember, we talked about determinants and distribution as being part of epidemiology in chapter 1. Well, he mapped this distribution and he started seeing that there were clusters of cases around these water pumps. So that's what led him to the belief that cholera, the infection, was actually being spread by the water supply. And then so he interviewed all the people living in the areas, found out where their water supplies were, and identified the water supply and the idea that this was being transferred via the water pump handle. Okay. One of the biggest issues he had in his study was the fact that a lot of individuals couldn't remember who their water supplier was. So we were looking at two major water suppliers, Lambeth Company and Southwark and Vauxhall Company. So one of the issues what he had were that many of the individuals couldn't remember which of the water suppliers they used. Okay. So when he collected this information, um, he was able to determine that the Vauxhall and Southwark water suppliers was the one that was creating kind of a much higher death rate than the Lambeth. Louis Pasteur discovered a vaccine for anthrax. He was vital in determining that bacteria could cause disease, so it wasn't just something that could materialize out of air. Okay, this led to Robert Koch also establishing the germ theory of disease and using photography to take first pictures of microbes to show the world that microorganisms do in fact exist and that they are what causes disease. And once again, these ideas from Pasteur and Koch were very cutting edge at the time, this whole idea of a germ theory, something that causes disease. Because prior to this, it was thought that bad will or something that you did or some kind of a curse could actually bring about disease or illness. Okay, so this whole idea of there actually being a cause, a microbe that's causing disease, was something that was fairly new in this time frame. Okay. John Gott was someone who really looked at the who. Okay, so he looked at the who and how many. He started recording how many people died each year and what kind of event or disease caused that. This is important because, once again, this whole idea of surveillance and knowing what are our risk factors. Are there certain genders that are risk factors for events or diseases? Okay. William Farr was vital in the idea of vital statistics. We get a great deal of information from birth certificates and death certificates. We are sometimes limited by incorrect information or incomplete information on these forms of information, but still incredibly important for allowing us to kind of track a population. Uh, Bernardino Ramazzini was someone who was looking at disease among workers and looking at the harmful character of materials that the workers handled. Okay, so this was looking at what's the environment, what type of environment was bringing about these health issues or these disorders. Okay. And then, of course, Florence Nightingale, the nurse who really created a great amount of change and acceptance for certain hygiene and overall treatment of patients. Typhoid Mary uh, was key to helping us understand the idea of someone being a chronic carrier of a disorder. She expressed no symptoms or signs of the disease, but through epidemiology, they were able to track back to her as the cause of these 250 cases of typhoid fever. All right. And to Takaki, once again, you can read about this in your textbook. Okay. Shatuk looked at sanitation and public health problems. And once again, all these individuals that we're talking about kind of laid the groundwork for all of these aspects that we have to look at in public health. Okay. All right. And these last couple, once again, please do read about these individuals in your textbook. The Framingham study, we are going to talk about a little bit later, but this is a great example of prospective cohort study design in which we had this large group of individuals that we've been following over tens of years to look at risk factors for cardiovascular disease. All right. Okay. And once again, I welcome you guys to read this information in the textbook, but I did want to cover some of the individuals that I found to be kind of key to the past history. Once again, please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.